Have you ever snapped at your partner after a rough day at work, even though they didn't actually do anything wrong? Or you found yourself insisting that someone else was jealous when it was really you who was feeling uneasy? That is not random. That is personality. And by the end of this video, you will have 7 different lenses to understand why you and everyone else around you do the things you do. Let's get into it. Welcome back to the Psychology Notebook. I am Desiree, and in this video, we are tackling one of psychology's biggest questions. What makes you, you? Now, I titled this lecture, The Many Lenses of You, and I'm drawing from personality psychology because there are many lenses to explain your personality and why you do the things you do. So why does personality psychology even matter? Well, learning about personality psychology is important because it helps you understand that it's not just a label, right? Like it's not just a label that you can just place on yourself because you took a personality quiz. Personality psychology is much deeper than that. It explains patterns and how people think, how they feel, why they make the choices they make, how and why people cope in different situations. And then not only that, but how we relate to others. Personality psychology explains mental health beyond disorders. And this is extremely important in personality psychology because currently personality psychology raises questions of whether or not the current disease model that we treat mental health disorders is actually appropriate. Sometimes in personality psychology, those lines between disorders and a personality trait can be blurred. All right, so let's take a look at today's roadmaps so you can understand how this video is set up. So first, we're just going to go over the foundations. Then we're going to move on to the unconscious perspectives in psychology, starting with Sigmund Freud, and then moving forward in this video of different theorists who built upon personality psychology. So just because we start with Freud, we're not going to end with Freud. Next, we'll go into the traits, which is important if you actually are studying psychology in academia. Not only that, we'll go into growth. So how do people grow? How do we become ourselves? Next, we'll tackle learning, then biology. And then finally, we'll just bring it all together so that way you can understand the multiple lenses of personality psychology and the multiple lenses of you. So by the end of this video, you should be able to define the terms personality, temperament, character, trait, and state. You'll be able to compare major perspectives, such as psychodynamic perspective, trait theory, humanistic theory, social cognitive theory, and biological theory. You will be able to explain why personality is partly stable and partly shaped by context. And then you'll be able to apply these terms and this information that you learn in this video to real life behavior without reducing yourself into other people to labels. All right, so let's start with the basics and identify the difference between personality, character, temperament, trait versus state, and explain exactly what we are looking at because it is very often that students and other individuals learning about psychology mix up these terms. So from the psychology perspective, let's start with how we define personality. So psychology defines personality as the unique and relatively stable pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that define you over time. Now, those key words there are relatively stable patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So when we're talking about your personality in psychology, we're looking at things that are stable and consistent over like a long duration of time. Now, character is your moral compass, and this includes ethical decisions like honesty and integrity. So character is how a person reacts, like how we look at what is good and what is bad. Now, the difference between personality and character is that personality is viewed as something that you don't always have control over. It's just part of like who you are. Whereas character, you have more of a choice of if you're going to act ethical or unethical, if you're going to act good or if you're going to act bad. That's part of your character. And then next is temperament. Now, temperament is defined in psychology as your biological default settings. These are the raw emotional tendencies visible even when you were an infant. So going back to my Psych 101 series in lesson 4, I talked about nature versus nurture. Temperament is going to be part of that nature part. Character is going to be part of the nurture part. So when you think about trait versus state, think about trait being something that is consistent across many different domains within a person, as where a state is just something that's temporary, like a temporary feeling, a temporary pattern of thoughts, or a temporary behavior. So let's start with Sigmund Freud. He is the founder of psychoanalysis, and you probably heard of his name before, but you might not be so familiar with his contributions to psychology. So first, Freud is attributed to the unconscious, and that's the belief that much of our behavior is influenced by thoughts and motives outside of our awareness. Next, he's also attributed to identifying, or his model of the id, the ego, and the superego, which are different parts of our consciousness. Now, he has many different defense mechanisms in psychology. In this video, I'm going to talk about 4, including repression, projection, and displacement. So the key takeaway here for Sigmund Freud is that our inner conflicts shape personality and behavior, and a majority of that is unconscious. Now going a little bit deeper into this unconscious lens that Sigmund Freud proposed in psychology. The ego is part of like the conscious mind. This is your conscious awareness. These are things that you can just actively recall in your mind. And then the second layer, according to Freud, is the preconscious mind, which is considered the superego. And this is your strict moral compass, and it holds the internalized rules of society. So the preconscious mind kind of sits in between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, meaning that it can oscillate or go between conscious awareness and the unconscious mind. So that's kind of the internal conflict that Freud is pointing to here, is like this in-between middle of the preconscious mind and morality coming into place, where we struggle with acting in moral ways based upon what we can consciously see in our reality, but then also our unconscious mind and our motivations. And that's where the id comes in. And it's like the inner toddler parts of ourselves where it's just based on instant gratification. And Freud says that those are unconscious to ourselves, but they're still driving our behavior. So now moving on to Freud and defense mechanisms. And I titled this slide, The Ego's Bodyguards. So whenever the conflict in your mind creates too much anxiety, your ego uses unconscious psychological strategies called defense mechanisms to protect yourself. Now, there are more than 4 defense mechanisms in psychology, but in this video, I just wanted to talk about the 4 big ones that we probably have experienced in our own lives, so that way you understand what Freud is actually saying about psychology. The first defense mechanism is displacement, and displacement is when the feeling lands on the wrong target. So everyday example is, let's just say your boss is angry at you and he takes it out on you, but because it's your boss, you kind of can't just yell back at him, so you kind of just hold on to those feelings until you redirect it to a safer target. Usually these are people that are closest to us. And remember, this is unconscious, so you might not be fully aware that you're doing this until after like these events occur, but that essentially is displacement. So the key takeaway here is that the emotion is real, but the target changes because it's just safer. Next is rationalization, and this is something that everybody does, but rationalization in psychology is defined as the story we tell ourselves after a specific fact. Rationalization is creating a logical sounding explanation to protect your self-esteem or reduce discomfort. And an example is, after rejection, somebody says, "I didn't want it anyway." So the key takeaway for rationalization is rationalization offers a comforting explanation for whenever we're feeling distressed, rejected, or just not so good, or our ego feels a little bit hurt. Now looking at projection. So this defense mechanism in psychology is defined as attributing your own uncomfortable feelings or traits to another person. So an everyday example of this would be like someone who feels jealous. They would insist that everyone else is jealous. Now, typically whenever projection happens, because again, we're talking about things that are unconscious to us, we don't necessarily have the words. All we have are those feelings. So The key takeaway with projection is that my feeling or the feelings that you feel gets shifted into somebody else's problem to protect your ego or to protect yourself. And moving on to repression. So repression is a defense mechanism that is defined as keeping painful memories, feelings, or memories out of conscious awareness. Essentially, it's just pushing down as deep as possible into our unconscious minds the painful thoughts, feelings, and memories that may be attributed to circumstances like trauma. But the thing with repression is that just because you're pushing it down out of your conscious awareness, meaning you're not thinking about it every day, you're not talking about it every day, you're not essentially like dealing or healing with it, but that is still in your unconscious awareness. And according to Freudian psychology, those feelings and those memories just don't disappear because of repression. They're actually unconsciously driving and motivating your personality and your behaviors. So now let's move forward from Freud to the Neo-Freudians. So maybe you have seen these faces before or heard of these names, but here we have Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and Karen Horney. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. If it is not correct, you can just correct me in the comments, that's fine. But these three key theorists are attributed to be like the Neo-Freudians, and they expanded upon or challenged a little bit of what Sigmund Freud was saying in his theories about personality and the unconscious and what actually drives human behavior and personality. So very briefly, I'm going to explain the different perspectives of Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and Karen Horney, just so that you can understand what essentially they were trying to contribute to the field of psychology. Carl Jung, he believed that we shared a collective unconscious that's full of universal symbols and archetypes. Carl Jung proposed that we all wear a social mask that's called a persona while hiding our dark side in what is termed the shadow. If you want me to talk more about Carl Jung here on the Psychology Notebook, comment down below. I can. On my other channel, Desiree Clemens, I do have some videos going deeper into Carl Jung and the shadow and art therapy. I will link them down below in the description if you're familiar with Carl Jung and you want to explore some of his ideas of how we all share a symbolic unconscious. It's really interesting. Anyway, next, moving on to Alfred Adler. Now, Alfred Adler is a really interesting theorist. He focused on the birth order and our innate striving for superior. He suggested that we spend our lives trying to overcome a deep inferiority complex. But what's so interesting about Alfred Adler and like this birth order is that how we are born in our family unit, like the order of our birth, determines our personality. So for example, I am like the third born of like three, so I have two older sisters, and Alfred Adler was the one that suggested like the youngest of the three is going to act different than, let's say, like my oldest sister, like the firstborn. So that's something to think about and look at like within your own family unit and like your birth order and where you were born, and see if maybe that influenced your personality. So moving on to Karen Horney. Now she emphasized that culture shapes our personality and shapes who we are. She emphasized more of like the nurture part of us, and she explored basic anxiety. And basic anxiety being that the feeling of being isolated in like a hostile world and having like a neurotic need, or we develop a neurotic need to cope with it. So essentially, Karen Horney was suggesting that a lot of our internal conflicts and the distress that we feel is actually a result of culture and society, and we're kind of forced to develop these things. So now moving on to trait theory, and trait theory is like the core and extremely important to personality psychology. And what's so great and special about trait theory is that these psychologists raise the question about what even is a personality, right? Because psychology is a science. There has to be something in the personality that can be consistent, that can be measured, that can be predictable, essentially follow like the scientific method. I'm not going to get into that here, but because psychology is a science, there has to be something within the personality, like I said, can be measured and can be scientific. And that's where trait theory comes in. And the key theorists and contributors are Gordon Allport, Raymond Cattell, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Hans Eysenck. You can let me know in the comments if I pronounce that wrong. But let's briefly discuss what their contributing theories and ideas, or what they contributed to the field of personality psychology with their ideas and theories. Measurement lens. So now we're going to look at trait theory. And like I previously said before, personality psychology is considered a science because psychology is a science. Now, in order for psychology to be considered a science, it has to go through the scientific method, go through testing, meaning that there has to be something within the personality that we can test, something that we can measure, something that we can observe over a long period of time. And previously, in the beginning of this video, I explained the difference between trait and state. And I said that trait was those consistent parts of our personality. Traits are those consistent parts of our personalities because the traits are the things that we can actually measure in psychology to call it an actual science. Gordon Allport, he differentiated traits by importance. Cardinal traits are the traits that we possess during our entire life. Central traits are traits that are core to your foundation, and then secondary traits are traits that only show up in specific situations. Raymond Cattell boiled personality down into 16 underlying source traits that create surface traits that we see. And then Hans Eysenck reduced traits down into like 3 measurable areas of psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. And each individual will fall on like different spectrums of like those 3 different scales. Let's talk about what is the current model up to date right now at this recording that psychologists use to study and identify your personality, their personality, and like everybody's personality. And the current model standard is called the Big Five, and it has an acronym of OCEAN. Now, the Big Five is free to take, and if you take it, it will measure 5 different aspects of your personality. It will measure where you fall on the spectrum of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And this personality test is one of the most widely accepted frameworks in modern psychology because it is consistent and valid, thus suggesting that this is the most accurate personality test out there and available. So now looking at the humanistic lens, and there are 2 key theorists here, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. These perspectives in the humanistic lens focuses on the human potential, growth, and the self. So we're moving away from all that unconscious early childhood stuff. We're looking beyond just the scientific lens of, okay, well, let's measure and, reduce people down to numbers and statistics. Rather, humanistic lens, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, and other theorists in psychology look at what drives a human being to succeed, like what drives a person to grow, what drives a person to want to do better. All of this stuff about human growth and human potential is what the humanistic lens in psychology focuses on. So humanistic psychologists like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers argued that earlier theories, they felt that they were too dark and too deterministic. Humanistic psychologists believe that people have free will and that there is an inherent drive to fulfill your unique potential. Specifically, Abraham Maslow, he designed the hierarchy of needs pyramid, and he suggests that an individual cannot reach self-actualization, which only a small percentage of people do, like a really small percentage of people. And self-actualization means like your full potential, like you realize who you are as a human being. But you can't reach your full potential until your basic survival and social needs are met first. It's not that once your basic survival needs are met that you automatically get self-actualization or you reach your full potential. It's that you can like begin to have more of like a safety net to pursue that path. Now, Carl Rogers explored things like self-concept and identity and described distress happening when there is a massive gap between your real self and your ideal self. Carl Rogers is heavily associated with unconditional positive regard. And what that means is that humans require an unconditional positive regard in order to feel accepted and loved without having strings attached. So once a human being is met with unconditional positive regard, typically this is done within therapy. And once that person feels acceptable and they have that safety net, then we can go back over to these hierarchy needs of Maslow's. In this perspective, we can kind of marry the two, and then the individual is able to set out and to reach their full potential. So that's what the humanistic psychology and the humanistic psychology lens looks at. So now I want to introduce you to Albert Bandura's Reciprocal Determinism. And I don't have a picture of him, but he is another key theorist. And reciprocal determinism sits in the middle of, or satisfies that nature and nurture perspective that we see within psychology. So previously in this video, we talked about Freud, we talked about Jung, Adler, and Horney, where a lot of their psychological theories are based in determinism, meaning that we are driven heavily by things that are unconscious to us, or it's biology that's influencing our behaviors and our personality. Whereas the humanistic theories that we just talked about that are associated with Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers promote free will and that freedom of choice that an individual can change. So because this is psychology and the science, we already know that it's both, right? An individual is influenced, or their personality and their behavior and their mental processes are influenced not only by the biology, unconscious development, things that we don't have control over, which would be the nature part of it, but then also the nurture part of it. So this can be society, this can be culture, and this can also be our choices. So here, Albert Bandura gives us something that satisfies both of these different perspectives of having free will to do things versus not. Here is an example of that in real life. So let's just say an individual has a personal belief that they are terrible at math. Well, because they hold that personal belief, their behavior is then going to reinforce that personal belief in that narrative. That's just what the mind does. No one's immune to that. So what it looks like is they avoid studying. Now, this is not always done on a conscious level. Like the person is saying, I'm bad at math, so I'm going to avoid studying. Sometimes that happens. Other times, most likely, the individual will just distract themselves. They'll pick up their phone, they'll get up and they'll do something else. So it's hard to catch that behavior because it looks normal from the outside looking in, okay? So because of that person avoids studying because they distracted themselves or they just purposely intentionally didn't study, what ends up happening in their environment is that they failed the quiz or they failed the class. Therefore, it reaffirms that personal belief that they're terrible at math. And what this does is it creates a loop, right? And that loop will stay in until you catch it, right? What psychology wants to do is, if this is a negative loop, right? If you're not getting the results that you want in your environment, you can change the loop essentially. And how you can change this loop is by engaging in something called self-efficacy. And it's the belief that you can improve, right? So Albert Bandura is suggesting that we're going to start with that personal belief and change that personal belief so that it influences your behavior and then it will influence your environment. So according to Bandura, if you believe that you are terrible at math, the first thing we would want to do to change the outcome would be to suggest, hey, you can improve math. And once a person believes that they can improve their ability to do math, they will then seek out behaviors to support that, such as getting a mentor, learning different ways to do math, maybe engaging in math that is more appropriate at their level. There's just more openings to solutions to the issue. And then we will see in the environment if those behaviors that the individual did actually improved their math score. But remember, because this is personality psychology, what we're looking at and identifying is trait versus state. So being terrible at math can definitely be something that is a personality trait, such as a person that has more of an abstract way of thinking versus something like logical and linear. versus whether or not this could just be a state or influenced by a state where somebody might feel that they're terrible at math, but it could be other influencing factors, like maybe how the material is being delivered. Maybe it's the teacher. Maybe there's other things in that environment or behavior that can be shifted so that the individual improves in math. And then whenever the individual improves at math, we can see what that indicates in psychology of, is it a trait or was it just a state? Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the famous study of like the marshmallow test by Walter Mischel, but if you haven't, don't worry, I'm going to explain it to you because it really is a fun study, or if you've ever watched any of the footage, it's really, it's just kind of cute. So the goal was simple. The children had to wait until the facilitator came back into the room and they would get 2 marshmallows if they did not eat the 1 marshmallow. Well, naturally, some children ate the marshmallows, other children waited, and they got 2 marshmallows. So then they continued to follow these children throughout life. The research found that the children who waited to have 2 marshmallows had better impulse control, they had stronger academic performance, and they had better relationships in life, versus the children who did not wait to have the second marshmallow. All right, so now let's go a little bit deeper into the biological lens, because biology provides the foundation of our personality, but does not determine everything about us. But it does influence our genes, our brains, and like how we actually think, feel, and behave. So in psychology, recognizing that nature and nurture part, here we're talking about the nature part. So we know that our genes influence our temperament. Remember, those are the consistent and steady parts of us, and our potential. Not only that, but our brain. So our biology shapes our emotions, decisions, and social behaviors. That is important to know within psychology. And then, just our body and our biology. So things like hormones, health, and development affect how we experience life. So that's going to affect how our personalities are developed, but also looking at the different states we're in. So remember previously in the beginning of the video, we had mentioned trait versus state, where trait is going to be the biological consistent parts. So here though, in the biological lens, it's inherited. So from your genes, your mom and dad, you definitely have your personality traits influenced by your parents. It just is what it is. Not only that, your brain systems and chemicals influence how we react, learn, and relate to others. Now, this is important here because whenever we're taking medications or drugs, we're influencing our biological systems and with the use of chemicals. So again, that's going to influence our personalities, how we behave in different situations, and then our environment. So our experiences, our relationships, and the choices that we make within our environment also influence who we are. So how do psychologists actually measure this? Like, how do we know and study the personality? Well, there's actually a few different methods and ways that psychologists use to study a person's personality. The main goal, or one of the main goals of personality psychologists try to do, is to get as much information, like I said, from birth, the beginning of life to the end of life of an individual, just so that way we can see what is consistent. But that is so difficult and hard to gather that data and to find participants while remaining ethical and anonymous. So typically what we do in the psychology field and researchers is we use things like self-report inventories, projective tests. So as you can see, studying personality and studying an individual's trait is not easy. And not only that, there are still debates and conversations happening within the psychological community because personality psychology gives birth to trait theory, which then raises questions of how we're treating mental health disorders. So this was a mouthful and definitely a longer video than I expected it to be, but there's so much about personality psychology that I could talk about even beyond what I shared in this video. But let's just bring it all together and ensure that you are taking the right notes in your psychology notebook. So if you have a psychology notebook, go ahead and grab it and take down these notes. These are important for you to remember in case you missed any parts of this lecture or this video. What you need to take away and write in your psychology notebook is 1, you are a biological organism with inherited hardwiring. Yes, your genes you inherited from your parents matter a heck of a lot more about who you are, your personality, and how you relate to yourself and others is influenced by your genetics. It is what it is. 2, you are driven by deep unconscious motives. Yes, everybody has an unconscious parts of their brain and their wiring, and science and psychology and biology is still trying to understand what consciousness is or why some of these systems in our bodies just automatically work without our conscious awareness. But you do have an unconscious part of your being, and that is driving your behaviors and your motives. 2, you display measurable, stable traits. Yes, there are parts of your personality and parts of your being that were shown when you were a baby. They were shown when you were a child. They are shown right now in your current life stage, and they're going to show in your next life stage. Next, you constantly learn from and react to your environment. This is so important and so crucial that I feel like a lot of people just goes in one ear and out the other. But your environment, that means your home environment, your school environment, your community, your people you are constantly around, your family, like your actual physical environment where you are at matters more than you think. It is influencing more than you think. And remember, you are always striving for growth and self-actualization. So just because we all have limitations by our biology and we are all driven by our deep unconscious motives, that does not mean that we do not have a choice to change, to grow, and to heal, or to become better versions of ourselves. You can do that. And these are my resources. Some of these textbooks were textbooks that I had from my graduate studies. You did it! Thank you so much for learning with me today. If you want a visual shortcut for mastering psychology, be sure to check out the Psychology Flashcards pack on sale now. The link is down below. And don't forget to check out thepsychologynotebook.com and sign up for the newsletter to get the Psych 101 lessons with Frank the Sasquatch delivered right to your inbox. And if you want to go deeper into personality and get a crash course on all of the major terms, be sure to check out this video right now on your screen. Click it and I'll see you over there.